Warning, some viewers may be too lame to enjoy the following information.
Cedar Point and Sandusky, Ohio market themselves as the roller coaster capital of the world. As of 2020, the park boasts a collection of 17 multi-million-dollar roller coasters that span across the park's 364 acres. Many of them were record-breaking rides when they debuted. Magnum XL 200 opened in 1989 as the world's first hyper roller coaster, which is a coaster that stands over 200 feet or about 61 meters tall. Millennium Force debuted in 2000 as the world's first Giga roller coaster, which is a coaster that stands over 300 feet or about 91 meters tall. Following that, Top Thrill Dragster opened in 2003 as the world's first Strata roller coaster, which is a coaster that stands over 400 feet or roughly 122 meters tall. Cedar Point lost the height record to Six Flags Great Adventure, who opened Kingda Ka in 2005. So many thought that for Cedar Point's next roller coaster, they would attempt to take the height record back with a monster 500-foot or 152-meter tall roller coaster. But Cedar Point actually did the opposite. On September 7th of 2006, the park announced that they would be adding Maverick, a multi-launching roller coaster, or more accurately called a Blitz coaster, from Intamin Amusement Rides. Maverick stands only 105 feet or 32 meters tall, making it the shortest major roller coaster that Cedar Point has built since Iron Dragon in 1987. Many were shocked at the small size, but little did they know that this little roller coaster would end up being one of Cedar Point's best. So I guess you can say it's not all about size, it's how you use it. Maverick was a new roller coaster concept from Intamin that combined a few older technical elements into a new and unique experience. But these new elements represent their own fun set of problems that we'll discuss in this video. But first, let's talk about Maverick's ride experience. Maverick was built on the site of the former Whitewater Landing attraction. Whitewater Landing was an aerodynamics log flume that opened at the park in 1982 and closed at the end of 2005 to make way for a new attraction. Fun fact, Maverick's covered queue line actually uses the old station building of Whitewater Landing. As far as I know, Maverick would be the first roller coaster built by Intamin to use extremely snappy transitions, meaning the ride would change directions very quickly. These were eminent in the ride's animated promotional material. Trains would switch from left to right in the blink of an eye. The ride even featured an extremely low to the ground Heartline roll, which was probably the most shocking part of the ride. Even more shocking than the actual ride experience itself, which seems so different than most launching roller coasters built prior. I can remember watching the animated POV back in 2006 at my best friend Brandon's house, aka B-Man the Antagonist, on his slow dial-up internet. It took probably 5 hours to load the full video, but it was worth it. After a 2-week delay due to the removal of the Heartline roll, which I will discuss later in the video, Maverick opened to the public on May 26th of 2007. Since then, the ride was commonly regarded as Cedar Point's absolute best attraction until the introduction of Steel Vengeance 11 years later in 2018. Riders begin their experience by boarding into one of Maverick's 6 trains. Each train features 3 cars that seat a total of 12 riders. Each train is also a different color, which I think is a great visual. Riders secure their over-the-shoulder harness and secure their seatbelt. 2 trains are then dispatched from the station at a time to help boost capacity. The first train will advance forward into the launched lift hill. The ride is powered by linear synchronous motors, or LSMs. These are the white fins that line the lift hill. The LSMs magnetically accelerate the train to the top of the first hill at over 20 miles per hour. This incline is only sloped at 20 degrees. The LSMs cut off towards the crest, which allows the train to pause for a brief moment before whipping into the 95-degree drop. It's short in height at only 100 feet or 30.5 meters, but somehow it manages to hit 95 degrees in that short span. This drop is especially good in the back row. Riders are flung out of their seats from the ejector airtime and then quickly slam back into a tight pullout. The train continues through a low-to-the-ground turn and then suddenly banks left into a low-to-the-ground left turn. The quick motion of the transition offers both airtime and extreme lateral forces at the same time. The train continues into a smaller left turn and then quickly banks to the right, delivering another moment of airtime and lateral forces. Be prepared for your entire body to be thrown up and to the side during these moments. The train continues into a low-to-the-ground right-hand turn and then pulls up into a nice ejector airtime hill. The hill doesn't feature airtime as strong as a ride like Steel Vengeance, but it's a nice change from the low-to-the-ground turns before. And it doesn't matter what seat you're sitting in. With how small the trains are, you will get airtime over the hill regardless. The ride drops back down and banks into a low-to-the-ground right-hand turn. The train pulls back up into the first half of the horseshoe roll, which is basically 2 back-to-back corkscrews. I've always found this element to be kind of meh. The inversions don't feature any hang time or whip, so it's not really my favorite part, but it's still fun. The ride completes the second corkscrew and drops into a 180-degree low-to-the-ground right-hand turn that heads underneath the station. Riders are given a quick pop of airtime as the train levels out into a brake run. This brake run will slow down trains to different speeds, and I will explain that later in the video. After a brief pause, the train launches to 70 miles per hour, or 113 kilometers an hour in about 3 seconds, all while inside the tunnel. It's not the most intense launch in the world, but it really does the job. The LSMs that Intamin use do a great job of giving a good kick of acceleration, especially right at the start of the launch. The train gets up to speed and snaps to the left and exits the tunnel through a left-hand turn. The ride banks into a brief moment of straight track where the ride unfortunately engages a set of magnetic trim brakes. Now the trim brakes don't really matter, as they're actually very necessary so that the remainder of the ride isn't too intense. If I had to guess, Cedar Point wanted that launch to be 70 miles per hour regardless, so Intamin gave that to them, but as a result, they have to slow down the train just a bit for the remainder of the ride. This hill doesn't offer too much airtime, but it's cool that it's not a tall top hat that the train barely makes it over. Intamin or most manufacturers usually place a tall top hat immediately after a launch that the train barely makes it over, but Maverick just hauls over this hill, keeping the pacing alive. The train crests the hill and banks to the right through a swooping right-hand drop. The train reaches ground level as it continues through a right-hand turn as water canyons blast in a synchronized pattern. The train flies in between two rock walls and enters a more spread out S-turn that gives a little pop of airtime. This S-turn was originally an insane heartline roll that never truly saw the light of day. I'll get more into that later. The ride continues at ground level for a bit before entering the first Stengel dive. This maneuver begins with trains climbing into the air while banked to the left, and then quickly snapping to the right into an overbanked turn. This element hugs the bottom of the 95-degree first drop. It delivers an insane amount of lateral forces that also gives a good pop of airtime. The ride continues into a swooping right-hand turn that sits on top of the first S-turns from earlier in the ride. The track climbs into the second Stengel dive, which manages to be even crazier than the first one. Riders whip to the left, delivering a serious amount of lateral and airtime forces. After maneuvering through the overbank, the ride snaps back to the right, delivering a second moment of laterals and airtime. So this Stengel dive features 2 quick snaps, while the first Stengel dive only featured 1. The ride whips out of the Stengel dive and flies over a low-to-the-ground bunny hill, which delivers riders one last pop of ejector airtime. The ride then banks to the right and flies upward into the final brake run, ending the ride. Overall, Maverick is one jam-packed roller coaster. It's insanely unique with the ride elements that it uses and also the non-stop quick transitions it features. The launch lift hill is honestly bizarre, and I think it's such a cool concept. The 95-degree first drop is absolutely insane and is way more intense than the 300-foot drop found on Millennium Force or even the 400-foot drop on Dragster. The ride doesn't feature excessive positive G-forces, but a good amount of them consistently through the whole ride. Plus it's glass smooth, minus the lateral transitions that tend to toss unprepared riders around, but I wouldn't call that rough personally, I would just say forceful. I love the quick and snappy transitions that manage to deliver airtime as well as insane lateral forces, and the launch midway through the ride is so cool. I almost like to think of these elements as special effects. They add so much to the experience and help make this deceivingly little coaster one of Cedar Point's best. Many coaster enthusiasts rank this ride as one of their favorite roller coasters overall. For many, it's even their favorite. Having ridden similar roller coasters like Cheetah Hunt at Busch Gardens Tampa, Maverick is an adult version of that ride, as Cheetah Hunt is geared as a family coaster. Maverick is a full-fledged powerhouse that attempts to exert every type of force possible in your body during its 4,450 feet or roughly 1,356 meters of track. I'm curious how it compares to newer Intamin multi-launching roller coasters like Terran at Phantasialand or Taiga at Linnamaki. If you've ridden all three, feel free to comment down below your comparison. Now I personally don't rank Maverick as high as many seem to. While I do love Maverick, there are actually a few coasters at Cedar Point that I prefer to this ride. Maybe I'll rank my favorite roller coasters at Cedar Point one day. Although I'm not really a fan of ranking rides, but if you guys really want to see that, I'll see if I can make it happen. I would also confidently call Maverick one of Cedar Point's most innovative attractions. Even 13 years later in 2020, there aren't many roller coasters like it, especially in North America. But Cedar Point almost chose another attraction for the 2007 season that wouldn't have the same effect at all. I have heard that as an alternative to the Maverick we know, the park was highly considering purchasing a floorless roller coaster from Bolliger and Mabillard or B&M instead. The ride would have stood over 200 feet tall, roughly 61 meters, and would have been the world's tallest floorless roller coaster. I'm not sure how many inversions the ride would have had, but I can only imagine that since Cedar Point likes to break records, the ride would have had some sort of record inversion count. Either most inversions in the United States on one roller coaster, or possibly even in the world. In 2007, that would have required 8 inversions to break the US record, or 11 to break the world record. A lot of coaster enthusiasts would probably scoff at the idea of a B&M floorless coaster occupying the space that Maverick does today, but when you think about it, it does make sense why Cedar Point considered that attraction. Cedar Point had built 3 roller coasters between the years 2000 and 2003. All were built by Intamin and none of them focused on inversions, and instead focused on height and speed. This time around, the park may have been looking to break another record regarding inversions to attract guests. B&M were well established as a manufacturer who could deliver great looping roller coasters, and the park had built 2 prior B&Ms during the 1990s, so they were familiar with the product. And on the other hand, I'm sure Cedar Point weren't satisfied with the maintenance headache Intamin had delivered them in 2003, Top Thrill Dragster. Thus, from a business perspective, I get why the park would look elsewhere for a ride that could grab lots of attention and also run smoothly at the same time. If I had to guess, this is where the potential B&M floorless roller coaster came into the picture. And even better, that attraction would have been called Maverick as well, and would have featured an extremely similar theme. It's hard to picture, but Cedar Point could have very well never built the Maverick we know, and we'd instead be very familiar with a completely different Maverick. And this would have absolutely affected the transformation of the park's former stand-up roller coaster, Mantis, into the floorless roller coaster Rougarou in 2015. But parks don't usually seek interest with just one manufacturer, and will usually ask several to give proposals for a project. It still made sense for Cedar Point to ask Intamin for a proposal, because Intamin tend to discount rides when they are bought in bulk. Maverick cost the park $21 million to build, and that number could have been higher if the park hadn't installed 3 Intamin coasters prior. Those 3 Intamins were Millennium Force in 2000, Wicked Twister in 2002, and Top Thrill Dragster in 2003. And I'm sure Intamin proposed several ideas to the park. Those ideas probably range from larger versions of their multi-looping roller coasters like Colossus at Thorpe Park to the uniqueness of a ride like Maverick. I'm actually very curious if the general idea for the Maverick we know today was the park's idea or Intamin's idea, as Intamin are known for thinking outside the box. Or they'll pretty much do anything you ask them. Like if you want like a 500-foot roller coaster that only takes up 1 acre, ask them. They'll probably do it. Tell Sander that Ryan sent you. Now I think if Cedar Point had built a record-breaking B&M floorless roller coaster, it may have grabbed more attention from a marketing perspective than Maverick did. But we've seen what happens when the park has attempted to build record-breaking B&Ms after the introduction of rides like Millennium Force or Top Thrill Dragster. Gatekeeper and Valravn were 2 record-breaking B&Ms built in 2013 and 2016 respectively, and neither one of them are nearly as popular as when they first opened, especially Gatekeeper. Whereas rides like Millennium Force, Dragster, and especially Maverick seem to be just as popular as when they opened. And just to set the record straight, rides like Gatekeeper or Valravn would dominate any other park, but because this is at Cedar Point, the competition is fierce. So I'm sure the B&M floorless Maverick would have had a lot of attention in its first year, but after that, the ride would have probably become more of a B-list roller coaster at Cedar Point. Maverick may have not gained as much marketing hype at first, but the ride has made its presence known as one of Cedar Point's star attractions. Guests return to the park over and over for Maverick, which I think is far more important than a tacky attempt at a record holder. So I think overall, Cedar Point made the right choice. But I'm sure the park still wishes that Maverick had as high a ride capacity as a B&M floorless does. Unlike most of the roller coasters at Cedar Point, Maverick features very small trains. Each train is only 3 cars long and holds only 12 riders. Even Top Thrill Dragster has larger trains that hold 18 riders each. To compensate for a lack of riders per train, Maverick runs a total of 6 trains to help boost capacity. Intamin originally proposed that the ride would be capable of a theoretical capacity of 1,200 riders per hour, which if I had to guess is far lower than the capacity the 200-foot B&M floorless roller coaster would have offered. Cedar Point were probably like,
not great, not terrible,
and went through with purchasing the Intamin Maverick. For those of you who are unfamiliar, a block zone is a section of a ride that only one train may occupy at a time. At the end of a block zone is a method to stop a train from proceeding into the next block if that block is occupied. This is the safety system that prevents roller coaster trains from colliding with each other. Maverick operates with a total of 9 block zones. The block zones are as follows: rear station, front station, rear dispatch, front dispatch/lift, coasting 1, launch/coasting 2, pre-waiting, rear waiting, and front waiting. So the station consists of 2 block zones, front station and rear station. Front station is where the first train loads, and rear station is where the second train loads. Upon dispatch, the first train will proceed forward into front dispatch/lift, while the second train will pause in rear dispatch immediately before the lift hill. Once the train ascending the lift hill is boosted over the crest into the first drop, the train is now passed into the coasting 1 block zone. Coasting 1 is the first section of the ride that consists of the low to the ground S-turns and horseshoe roll. Coasting 1 then ends with this brake run in the tunnel. Remember that at the end of every block zone, there needs to be a method to stop a train, just in case the block zone ahead is occupied. Coasting 2 begins with the launch track and continues all the way till the end of the ride and ends with the final brake run. The pre-waiting block begins with this turn here into the second brake run here. Now you might think that the pre-waiting block begins immediately after the drive tires at the end of Coasting 2, but for some reason Coasting 2 continues to the turn here, and the train technically goes into the pre-waiting block around here. So in order for the next train to launch in the tunnel, the train ahead has to practically be parked in the pre-waiting block. And then the rear waiting block and front waiting blocks are where the two trains stack prior to advancing into the station. I hope that makes sense. The cool thing with the ride's design is that most of the block zones are right in the same area. In fact, they're basically on top of each other. This helps make all the block zones easier to manage, especially when the ride breaks down and needs to be evacuated. All the stuck riders will be closer together. Now, as effective as these block zones are, they don't actually allow Maverick to operate at 1,200 riders per hour. Maverick is actually only capable of 936 riders per hour. In order to do 1,200 riders per hour, 100 trains must be dispatched from the station each hour. With 2 trains being dispatched at a time, that means 50 dispatches total, or a dispatch from the station every 72 seconds. However, the maximum amount of dispatches is 39, or 78 trains per hour, or a dispatch from the station about every 92 seconds. It's funny because of the 4 Intamin Cedar Point purchase from 2000 to 2007, Intamin had supplied an incorrect capacity figure for 3 of them. Intamin had claimed that Millennium Force would be capable of 1,600 riders per hour. I even hear that they claimed upwards of 1,800 riders per hour, but the ride can only do 1,296 riders an hour. Intamin claimed 1,500 for Top Thrill Dragster, even when it ran 16 passenger trains when it had the original theming on the back car. And it's actually only capable of 1,080 riders per hour, and that was after the trains were increased to 18 riders per train. The only ride that Intamin seemed to have gotten right was Wicked Twister, which only runs 1 train. And then we have Maverick. And the funny thing is that Intamin still advertises Maverick as 1,200 riders per hour on their website. Now maybe there's a bit of a marketing trick to that number. I know with rides like Top Thrill Dragster or King Ka at Six Flags Great Adventure, the capacity figure was based on how many trains the launch system could launch an hour, but for some reason the figure oddly didn't account for how long it took trains to clear block zones, which delays launches. Maybe Intamin did the same thing with Maverick. Sander Kernox, if you're watching, please leave a comment down below as to how this happens. He is the president of the American division of Intamin and is responsible for many of the great American Intamin coasters that we have today. Thank you, Sander. Now, the more blocks you add to a ride, the more complicated it gets to talk about them. But let's give it a shot. Let's keep talking about them. 2 trains are dispatched from the rear station and front station blocks. The first train advances through the rear dispatch block and into the front dispatch/lift block. The second train advances out of the station and parks in the rear dispatch block as the 4 trains behind it advance forward into the station and waiting block zones. Now, the lift hill is its own block zone. If the block zone ahead is occupied, aka coasting 1, the LSMs on the lift hill will cut off and allow the train to slowly roll backwards down the lift hill. So as the train is boosted over the crest of the lift hill into the first drop, the train moves into the coasting 1 block zone. The second train sitting in the rear dispatch block could technically advance forward now into the lift block, but the train would reach the top of the lift hill before the train ahead clears the end of coasting 1, which would force the train to roll backwards down the lift hill. So the main operator at controls actually manually releases this train into the lift block. They just have to wait a bit longer until they do so. As the first train enters the second half of the horseshoe roll and heads towards the tunnel underneath the station, the operator at controls will typically advance the train parked in rear dispatch into the lift block. The first train enters the tunnel and passes through a brake run which ends the coasting 1 block. This train will then exit coasting 1 and enter the coasting 2 block, which is where the launch is. This train will launch and exit the tunnel as the second train begins to ascend the lift hill. Back in the day, it was common for both trains to intercept each other during the first angle dive that crosses underneath the first drop, but that doesn't happen as often anymore due to blocking issues. I'll explain more later. The first train will continue through the layout and approach the final brake run. The final brake run is the end of the coasting 2 block. Now, in order for the train behind it to launch in the tunnel, the coasting 2 block must be clear. So this first train must exit this portion of the brake run and pass over the tire drives here that end the coasting 2 block. But like I discussed earlier, for some reason the coasting 2 block doesn't actually end until about midway through this turn here. So in order for the next train to launch in the tunnel, the train ahead has to practically be parked in the pre-waiting block. Going back to the trains intercepting each other on the first drop and Stengel dive, this used to happen during Maverick's opening year. Oftentimes, the train dropping off the lift hill would do so before the train ahead cleared the Stengel dive beneath. And then when you entered the tunnel, your train would slow down much more than it does today before launching. The only reason you'd slow down so much in the tunnel was because the train was waiting for the coasting 2 block to clear, since this train was closer to the train ahead of it. That was what made the dueling possible, by keeping the trains close together. But nowadays, trains don't really intercept anymore. The first train will rocket through the Stengel dive, and then a few seconds later, the train will drop down the first drop. This move helps to keep trains further apart so that the block zones don't become as congested. Congesting the block zones is probably what would cause a lot of downtime for Maverick in the past, so the park now tries to avoid doing this. It's a weird concept, but having trains slow down in the tunnel too much could lead to trains getting closer and closer. Let's say if the ride crew dispatches the next pair of trains from the station like normal. If the train in the tunnel has paused for too long because trains were getting too close, the next train now ascending the lift hill could be forced to roll back because the train stopped in the tunnel ahead hasn't cleared the coasting 1 block. And I've actually seen this happen myself while watching the webcam, so it's still possible to do this, but ride operators typically avoid this. But I believe the ride is reprogrammed very often, so I think in 2019 it was possible, but years prior it might have not been possible. Now I'm sure the launch was more intense back in the day when trains did slow to a near stop, since the LSMs will boost trains to 70 miles per hour whether the trains start at a standstill or are rolling into the launch. But I'd personally rather have a more reliable ride, and I'm sure the thousands of people who ride Maverick every day would prefer that as well. Now you might think that spacing trains further apart would limit the ride's capacity, but I don't believe it actually really affects it. Because trains are only kept a few more seconds apart from each other, and this gap helps to prevent trains from crawling through the tunnel to wait for block zones to clear, so I really think there's almost no effect. I mentioned before that the main operator controls manually releases the second train into the lift block. You might be asking why this needs to be done manually, and I believe it's to account for trains that run at different speeds. Maverick uses magnetic brakes to slow down trains, and trains that are empty of riders will typically slow down much more than trains that are filled with riders. The brake runs at the end of Coasting 1 and Coasting 2 will slow down trains to an absolute crawl when they are empty of riders. If the computer automatically advanced the second train based on a timer into the lift hill, the timer would guarantee not take into account empty or slow moving trains. The train ascending the lift hill will guaranteed reach the top before the train ahead of it cleared the Coasting 1 block. Or the setup would happen later where the second train would reach the beginning of the Coasting 2 block before the train ahead of it cleared the brake run at the end of Coasting 2, which would force the train to stop in the tunnel. Instead, the operator controls will dispatch a train into the lift hill based on how fast trains are running. If trains are filled with riders and running fast, the operator is able to release trains into the lift hill much sooner than if trains are empty or running slow. Because of this, Maverick can only run at its theoretical capacity of 936 riders per hour when trains are fully loaded and running quickly, just like other Intamins at Cedar Point, such as Millennium Force or Top Thrill Dragster. If you recall from my video on Top Thrill Dragster, Dragster was intended to run 6 trains, but now only runs 5. Maverick runs almost identically to how Dragster was intended to run with 6 trains, just minus the separate unload station featured on Dragster, as Maverick uses a single load and unload station that can handle 2 trains at a time. Because of Maverick's design, it is forced to stack several trains behind the station. When running multiple trains, Maverick needs to have at least 2 trains stacked behind the station in order to dispatch. One reason is for multi-move that is used during dispatch that advances the trains leaving the station and also into the station at the same time. When running 6 trains, 2 trains will be on the course, 2 trains will be loading, and 2 trains will be stacked on the brake run. And oftentimes, a 3rd train will stack on the brake run, as operators have to wait until the 6th train is in the horseshoe roll before dispatch. I've never seen the ride operate with less than 4 trains, but when this occurs, operations become much slower than with 5 or 6 trains. With 4 trains, operators must wait to dispatch until the 2 trains on the course stack behind the 2 trains on the station before dispatch. This typically only occurs when it's raining, as Cedar Point runs their rides at reduced capacity during the rain. Maverick is capable of running even less than 4 trains, but I pray that you never see this happen. When running 3 trains, Maverick will dispatch 2 trains from the station, but the 3rd train will remain stacked in the front waiting block zone. It will stay here until the first train from the pair of trains that were just dispatched stacks behind it in the rear waiting block. Only then can the trains be advanced into the station to load, which slows down things even further. This is to avoid having riders moving around on the platform while another train is rolling into the station. So trains always advance into the station in pairs to avoid this. There is also no option to load and unload only 1 train at a time. The ride is programmed to always load and unload 2 trains. Unless it decides to run just 1 train, but if it's running 1 train, I'm leaving the park. Speaking of stacking, it is actually possible to have 2 trains stacked in the launch tunnel. Remember that the Coasting 1 block ends inside the tunnel and that the Coasting 2 block starts as well. Because Coasting 2 starts with a launch track, that means that there is a method to stop a train at the beginning of the launch track if the train were to roll back on the hill following the launch. The end of Coasting 1 is also fully capable of stopping trains since it's the end of a block zone. This makes it fully possible to have 2 trains stopped in the tunnel. Now it's very rare this ever happens, but if you get lucky and this does occur while you are on the ride, it is completely safe, and be sure to brag to the internet if this happens to you because it's rare. You'll have a lot of good karma coming your way on Reddit. And let's talk about the infamous Heartline roll. When Maverick was announced in September of 2006, it was supposed to feature a fast-paced Heartline roll shortly after the 70-mile-per-hour launch. The roll would have been at ground level and looked to be like the most intense part of the entire ride. The Heartline roll was constructed as planned, and the ride vehicles even tested through the Heartline roll for weeks. Just 4 days before Maverick was scheduled to open, the park announced on May 8th of 2007 that Maverick would be delayed because the Heartline roll needed to be removed. It was speculated that the Heartline roll caused too much discomfort to riders, and also that the roll exerted too many forces on the trains themselves, which could have shortened their lifespans. I hear that only one person ever got to experience the Heartline roll on Maverick. Sander Kernix, the president of Intamin Interrides LLC. Sander reportedly got off the ride and claimed the roll was far too intense for riders, which led to its removal. I hear that the roll did not place too much force on the trains though, so that wasn't the problem. This is why Maverick continued to test for several weeks even after the park announced that the roll needed to be removed. If the roll was too stressful for the trains, I'm sure the park would have stopped testing and resumed once the S-bend was installed to replace the roll. I also hear that the park attempted to slow down the launch to limit forces during the roll, but obviously this never sufficed as the solution to the problem. The park went on to replace 3 40-foot sections of track with new pieces that created the S-bend we have today. I also hear that these track pieces were fabricated by Intamin proactively in the project, just in case the Heartline roll was too intense for riders. The S-bend would be completed on May 24th of 2007, and Maverick officially opened just 2 days later on May 26th. Had track not been fabricated proactively, I'm sure that the opening date would have slipped further back into June of 2007 instead. Reprofiling steel roller coasters wasn't very common when Maverick was built in 2007, as computer-aided design had made designing and building roller coasters almost an exact science. But Intamin were famous for taking design risks and introducing cutting-edge ideas over and over, which is what we saw with Maverick overall. But it looks like they took the risk a little too far with the Heartline roll, which is why it was removed. Before this happened, the last steel roller coaster at Cedar Point that needed a track reprofile was Magnum XL 200. Be sure to check out my video to learn more about that. The Heartline roll wouldn't be the only change made to the ride. Maverick was originally supposed to feature a minimum height requirement of 48 inches, or roughly 122 centimeters. This would have allowed smaller kids to enjoy Maverick as well. But in May of 2007, Intamin recommended to Cedar Point that they raise the height requirement to 52 inches, or roughly 132 centimeters. This was done due to the intense riding experience of the coaster. I'm sure riders at a height of 48 inches would have been safely secured by the restraints, but I guess the riding experience itself was more intense than originally thought. The park's new for 2018 roller coaster, Steel Vengeance, also increased its minimum height requirement from 48 inches to 52 inches as well. And then we have a ride like Millennium Force, which originally opened with the 54-inch height requirement, which was then later decreased to a 48-inch height requirement. Maverick also received a new fancy set of over-the-shoulder straps to its restraints in 2015. The harder orange straps were replaced with soft black straps that are more forgiving during the snappy transitions to riders' necks. Many people are grateful for these new straps, but I'm actually in the minority here that preferred the harder straps. I know, I'm weird. It's probably just a me thing, but the older straps made the ride feel more intense during the snappy transitions. Overall, Maverick is one of the most unique roller coasters out there, and I am very happy the park installed the Maverick we know instead of a large B&M floorless roller coaster. Sorry, B&M. Intamin dominated the 2000s, and Maverick is one of the company's examples as to why they did. Maverick is smooth, forceful, intense, snappy, and just so different from most modern-day roller coasters, and I think it influenced roller coaster design language going forward. This is why the ride has snatched up such a good reputation and is one of the most popular attractions at Cedar Point, if only it had a higher capacity. I'm also really curious as to how intense the Heartline roll was. I'd pay money to give that thing a shot. I guess only Sander will know how intense it was. Lucky guy. Sander, if you're watching, please comment down below. Give us your review of the Heartline roll. That would be really sick. Now, I wouldn't call Maverick a problematic roller coaster. Magnum XL 200 really wasn't either, but this series serves more as a place to discuss the quirks that a specific roller coaster may have. And the name Problematic Coasters sounds so much better than roller coaster quirks, at least to me. Plus, I am the only person with access to this YouTube channel, so I can upload whatever I want. America. Anyways, I hope you found this video enjoyable, and I hope you learned something new. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on the post notification bell so you'll know when I upload my next video. Thank you for watching, everyone, and stay safe. Peace.